Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. Now, the full title of this novel is actually Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus. However, most people just refer to the book as Frankenstein. Now, I actually already did a review on this book a couple of years ago, but I recently took down my old review, which I know I do that a lot, and I'm sure that annoys some people, but the reason I took down my old review was because I recently reread the book, and I wanted to re-review it, like I wanted to talk about it again, and I've never really seen the point of having two reviews of the same book up on the same channel. Like, that whole idea never really sat right with me, so I took down my old review, and now I'm re-reviewing the novel. Now, Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus was first published in 1818, however, it was originally published anonymously. Now, the reason for this is because a lot of literary works that were written by women at this time were published anonymously because women at this time, unfortunately, were not viewed as being equals by society, which of course is ridiculous, but that is how things were at this time, so I guess publishers at this time felt like this book wouldn't be able to be taken seriously if people knew it was written by a woman. But in 1831, Shelley was able to republish the novel under her actual name. Now, there's actually a really interesting story on how Mary Shelley came up with the concept of this novel. Apparently, she came up with the idea for this novel when she was only 17 or 18 years old, and at the time she was Mary Godwin. I'm pretty sure Godwin was her maiden name, and her soon-to-be husband, Percy Shelley, who was also a very famous writer from around this time, they were spending a weekend with a bunch of friends of theirs, and apparently it was a stormy night, and they all had this little party game where they each tried to come up with the scariest story. And it was during this night that Mary Godwin conceived the idea for this novel. Now, Frankenstein, I would argue, is probably one of the most influential novels in Western literature, because even people who have never read this novel, or have never seen any of the various different adaptations of this novel, they still know the name Frankenstein. Like, the name Frankenstein is one of those names that has become so ingrained into our culture that everybody knows the name Frankenstein. Even if you've never read the book or have seen any of the different adaptations of this book, you know that name. And I actually think that both this and Bram Stoker's Dracula, which was written years and years after this, are probably two of the most influential horror novels ever written. Like, they're novels that are still probably going to be remembered even 100 years from now. Like, I honestly can't think of another horror novel outside of Frankenstein or Bram Stoker's Dracula that's more influential. Now, personally, I like this book a lot more than Dracula. Like, don't get me wrong, Dracula is a good book and all, but to me, Dracula always came off as being more of a pulp novel, while this book, I feel like, is a lot more philosophically driven and is a much deeper and far more intellectual story. Now, Frankenstein is one of my top 15 favorite books of all time. Like, I absolutely adore this book, and in my opinion, now the book was written almost 200 years ago now, and in my opinion, there's a reason this book is still remembered and still read almost 200 years later. Like, it's a very timeless story. Now, the plot of Frankenstein, it's actually interesting how this story is structured, because it's basically a story within the story. Now, the novel opens up with a series of letters that the captain of this ship is sending to his sister. Now, this captain, him and his crew, are up in the Arctic looking for the North Pole, and they find this man out on the ice on a dog sled, and they take this man in, and this man is very sick and is pretty much dying, but they manage to nurse this man back to health, and eventually the captain of this ship and this man become very good friends with each other. And eventually you find out that this man's name is Victor Frankenstein, and Frankenstein then tells the captain of this ship his story, and then it opens up into the story within the story, which takes up most of the book. Now, in the story, you find out that Victor Frankenstein was a young medical student who became obsessed with the concept of life and became obsessed with the mystery of what creates life, and it became his ultimate goal, his ultimate obsession, to create the perfect human being. And eventually in the story, Frankenstein actually creates a creature, but this creature does not turn out to be the way he wanted it, and he's so horrified by what he has created that he pretty much rejects and abandons his creature, and some time goes by and he thinks that he can leave this all behind him, but let's just say that his mistakes end up coming back to bite him in the ass. Like, it turns out that in the time since Frankenstein abandoned his creature, this creature has come to hate his own existence and now wants revenge on Frankenstein for creating him. And in the story, the creature ends up going after Frankenstein's friends and family. And that's the basic plot line of Frankenstein. Now, as I said before, I absolutely love Frankenstein. To me, this is definitely one of the greatest horror novels ever written. And it's not just one of the greatest horror novels ever written, but it's one of the greatest books of any genre. Like, this is definitely a classic piece of literature, and there's a reason this book is still read and remembered today. Now, Frankenstein is a great horror story, but it's also one of the most heartbreaking tragedy stories ever written, and it's also a profoundly moving character drama. The novel is also beautifully written. Like, the prose in this novel are almost poetic in the way that they're written. Now, as I said before, the subtitle of this novel is The Modern Prometheus, which is actually a very apt title for this story, because Prometheus is a character from Greek mythology. Now, according to the legend, Prometheus was a titan who tried to give the power of the gods to mankind, but then Zeus punished him for this, and Frankenstein in this story is a man who tries to emulate the gods. And the main moral of this story is that man should not try to play God, man should not try to emulate God, and the story is really about the consequences of what happens when man does play God. Now, in the story, the creature starts out misunderstood, but actually becomes quite intelligent. He actually becomes extremely intelligent, and he even teaches himself how to read, and there's a certain point in this book where the creature finds a bunch of books and reads them, and one of the books that this creature reads is John Milton's Paradise Lost. And in this story, there actually are quite a few parallels between this and Paradise Lost. Now, Paradise Lost was an epic poem written in the 17th century by John Milton. Now, the poem was a retelling of the biblical story of Adam and Eve. However, it was primarily told from the point of view of the fallen angel Lucifer. And what was interesting about that poem is it actually painted Satan as being somewhat of a tragic hero. And in this novel, when the creature reads Paradise Lost, at first he compares himself to Adam, but then he starts to compare himself to Satan. And these parallels with Paradise Lost actually connect back to what the major theme of the novel is. The theme of the novel is the consequences of man playing God, and in this story, Frankenstein tries to emulate God, and he succeeds at that. He becomes like God is. He creates life, but Frankenstein also neglects the fact that God has an enemy, Satan, and that's exactly what this creature ends up becoming to him. The creature starts out as his Adam, but ends up becoming his Satan. Now, what's interesting is while the creature represents Adam and Satan, Frankenstein himself kind of represents Adam and Satan as well, because Frankenstein, like Adam, tries to achieve knowledge that God did not intend for humans, because in the book of Genesis and in Paradise Lost, Adam and Eve ate from the forbidden tree and tried to gain knowledge that God did not intend for humans, and in this story you have Frankenstein try to achieve the knowledge of the gods, something that humans are not meant for. And Frankenstein in this story also kind of represents Satan, because Satan tried to be like God is. He tried to rebel against God, and the result was Satan ended up getting cast out of heaven into hell. You kind of have the same thing here, where Frankenstein tries to emulate God, and the result is his life ends up becoming a living hell because of this. So it's interesting that both Frankenstein and the creature kind of end up representing the same thing. The novel is also kind of a commentary on the dangers of obsession, because Frankenstein became so obsessed with creating the perfect human being that it ended up ruining his entire life and destroying his entire family. And the monster, once it's created and understands who created him, the monster ends up becoming so obsessed with getting his revenge on Frankenstein that the monster loses his innocence and loses his soul and becomes evil. So the novel is very much a commentary on the dangers of obsession. Now, the book can also be looked at as kind of a commentary on the loss of innocence, because the creature starts out innocent, but becomes evil after he has these experiences that really hardens him. Like, in the beginning, like, as the story progresses, the creature does become quite intelligent, but at first, the creature actually wants to, like, he wants to become friends with any humans that he encounters, but because of how the humans he encounter treat him, this turns him into a monster. The book is also very much a commentary on the cruelty of society, because you realize part of what made this creature evil is really how people treated it, and you realize that the only reason people treated it the way they did was because of how it looked. and the only reason that Frankenstein abandoned this creature is because of how it looked. Like, it's really a commentary on really just how superficial society can really be, and how if you're outside of the norm, you're almost like an outcast, and how being an outcast could turn somebody evil, and that's really what the book is a commentary on, or that's one of the commentaries in the book, is the cruelty of society. And you really do get the idea that if society was more accepting of somebody who's quote-unquote ugly, Victor may have been more accepting of this creature. Now, the relationship between Frankenstein and the creature is one of the most interesting and complex hero-slash-villain relationships in literature, in my opinion, because on the surface, Frankenstein is the protagonist of the novel, and the creature is the antagonist. However, if you look at it from both sides, you realize that both characters are really more like anti-heroes in the story, because you sympathize with both characters, but also come to hate both characters as well, because you realize that both characters are equally responsible for all the tragedy and the horror that happens within this story. Because you realize that if Victor were to just accept responsibility for this creature and take this creature in, then none of the events that transpired in this novel would have actually happened, and also you realize that this creature's desire for revenge against his creator only turns him into the monster that people saw him as. So you sympathize with both characters, but you also realize that neither character is blameless for what happens in this story. Now, in the years since this novel was written, many people mistaked the creature for being Frankenstein, which in a weird way is kind of apt, because the whole idea of the novel is that Frankenstein and the creature are becoming mirror images of each other, so even though in the novel the creature doesn't actually have a name, in a weird way it's kind of apt that the creature would end up taking on the name of his creator. Now, this book's use of narrators is interesting because, in a weird way, this novel kinda has three narrators. The opening and the closing of the novel is narrated by the captain of this ship, but the majority of the novel is narrated by Frankenstein himself. But there's a certain point in the story where Frankenstein and the creature come face to face, and the creature then tells Frankenstein what happened to him after Frankenstein abandoned him, and at that point in the novel, the creature ends up becoming the narrator for a certain amount of the novel. So it's kind of interesting that this novel kind of has three narrators, and in a weird way it's kind of like a story within the story within the story. But yeah, Frankenstein is a classic piece of literature, and in a weird way this novel has kind of become somewhat prophetic in ways that I don't think Mary Shelley could have ever predicted. Now, the reason I say this novel was kind of prophetic is because you just look at how much technology has advanced in the 20th century and into the 21st century, and it's actually kind of frightening that things that back during Mary Shelley's time were thought of as pure science fiction are now realities today. Like, cloning is actually a reality. Like, scientists have cloned animals before. So in a weird way, you have real-life Dr. Frankensteins walking around today. And in the 20th century alone, mankind has achieved things that back during Mary Shelley's time nobody would have ever thought man would be capable of. Like, you look at things like the atom bomb and stuff like that. Now, I'm not saying all science is bad. Obviously, science is a good thing. Like, science can better mankind, but I do think science can't just go blindly ahead. There has to be some kind of ethics to it, and I think that's what Mary Shelley was trying to say. Obviously, she couldn't have known, like, what mankind would have achieved in the 20th century, but when you think about all the things that mankind has done in the past 100 years, in a weird way, this novel is almost more relevant today than it was when it was written almost 200 years ago. Now, Mary Shelley has written other novels after this, but none of them quite had the same impact that Frankenstein had. Now, perhaps the most famous of the other novels that Mary Shelley did besides Frankenstein is the novel The Last Man, which is a very early example of the post-apocalyptic novel. Now, this novel has had countless different adaptations of it. Like, I think there were at least 100 different movies made that were either based on or inspired by this book, but hardly any of the film adaptations actually followed the book. Most of them only took the same basic idea of the book, but kinda did their own things with them. Hell, there are even some movies that just took the name Frankenstein and nothing else. Now, the first adaptation of Frankenstein came out in 1910, and the 1910 version of Frankenstein is actually only like 12 or 13 minutes long. Like, by today's standards, it would be considered a short film, but back then, movies were hardly even in their infancy at that point, so back then, a movie of that length would have been considered a full-length movie, because movies weren't really that long back then, but by today's standards, the 1910 version of Frankenstein would be considered a short film. And as you can imagine, the 1910 version of Frankenstein, given that the movie's only 13 minutes long, it only takes the same basic idea of the book, but hardly follows the book at all. But it is the first Frankenstein movie, so you gotta give it some respect in that regard. Now, you can actually watch the 1910 version of Frankenstein here on YouTube, because the movie's in the public domain, so you can watch it online. Just go onto YouTube and type in Frankenstein 1910, and that should take you to the movie. Now, perhaps the most famous film adaptation of this book is the 1931 film, which was put out by Universal and directed by James Whale. That is perhaps the most famous interpretation of this novel. Now, the 1931 version of Frankenstein starred Boris Karloff as the creature, and it's that version of the character from the 1931 version of this story that is perhaps the most famous interpretation of this character. Now, the 1931 version of Frankenstein from Universal had a couple of sequels made to it. In 1935, you had The Bride of Frankenstein, which I actually think is the best film of the Universal Frankenstein series, and out of all the Universal Frankenstein movies, I think The Bride of Frankenstein is the one that's probably the most true to the book, at least in terms of themes. After The Bride of Frankenstein, you had The Son of Frankenstein, and then you had The Ghost of Frankenstein, then you had the movie Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, which was also a sequel to the movie The Wolfman. Then you had the movie House of Frankenstein, which featured the Frankenstein monster, the Wolfman, and Dracula. Then you had the movie The House of Dracula, which was kind of a follow-up to House of Frankenstein. And the final film in the Universal Frankenstein series was Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, which acted as both a parody of the Frankenstein movies, as well as a sequel to the Universal Frankenstein series. And that movie also featured the Wolfman and Dracula. Now, besides the Universal Frankenstein series, there were, of course, countless other different adaptations and interpretations of this story. Now, perhaps my favorite interpretations of the Frankenstein story are actually the Hammer Frankenstein movies, which started in 1957 with the film The Curse of Frankenstein, which starred Peter Cushing as Victor Frankenstein, and I love the Hammer Frankenstein series, and perhaps my favorite film in the Hammer Frankenstein series is the 1974 film Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell. Now, as I said, most of the adaptations of Frankenstein only took the same basic idea of the book, but kinda did their own things with them. Hardly any of the adaptations really followed the book, and even Toho, who makes the Godzilla movies, tried doing their own Frankenstein series with the movie Frankenstein Conquers the World and its sequel, War of the Gargantuas, neither of which had anything to do with Mary Shelley's novel. They only used the name Frankenstein. Now, among some of the other interpretations of Mary Shelley's story, you have films like Jesse James Meets Frankenstein's Daughter, you have the 1974 Mel Brooks film Young Frankenstein, which was actually a spoof on the Universal films, and one of my personal favorites is the 1985 film The Bride, which is basically a remake of The Bride of Frankenstein, and it actually stars Sting as Dr. Frankenstein, and it has Clancy Brown as the monster. Now, the only adaptation of Frankenstein that I know of that actually tried to follow the book is the 1994 version, which was directed by Kenneth Branagh and actually starred Kenneth Branagh as Victor Frankenstein, and the movie also starred Robert De Niro as the creature. Now, I used to love that movie when I was a little kid, but I haven't seen it since I was a little kid. But looking back on it, there were a lot of aspects of that movie that were really cheesy. While the movie may have followed the book, I don't think that movie really did justice to how good the book actually is. And they're still making movies that are either based on or inspired by this novel even today. Like a few years ago, you had the film I, Frankenstein, which honestly looked really stupid. I haven't seen it yet, so maybe it's good, maybe it's shitty, but basically in that movie, Aaron Eckhart plays the Frankenstein monster, and I think he fights demons in it or something. It looked really stupid, but it looked like it could be fun, but once again, I haven't seen that movie yet, so maybe it's good, maybe it's shitty, I don't know. And just last year in 2015, you had the film Victor Frankenstein, which I haven't seen yet, but I actually have been wanting to see that movie. And there are many other different interpretations or adaptations of this novel that I'm not talking about because, honestly, there's just too many to name. Now, one of my favorite authors, Dean Koontz, has actually done a series of books that were inspired by this novel. Now, I've never read the Dean Koontz Frankenstein series, so I don't know much about them, but he has written a series of books called Frankenstein. So, the characters of Frankenstein and the creature really have gone on to become very iconic characters. So yeah, that's my review of Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus by Mary Shelley, and bye.